The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as people settled into their seats, their eyes shifting between the judge, the attorneys, and the man sitting in the witness stand, Officer Daniel Graves. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a stark glow on his uniform, but he didn't look as confident as a seasoned officer should. Across from him sat Karoline Leavitt, composed but unwavering, her gaze steady. It was a high-profile case, though not everyone in the room understood its full implications just yet. The prosecution had built its argument meticulously, presenting evidence that Graves had falsified his testimony about an incident involving Karoline months ago. At that time, she had been a well-known political figure in some circles, but Graves had seen her as just another citizen, someone without the power to challenge his authority. He had claimed she had resisted, that she had interfered with police work, that she had acted aggressively. But Karoline knew the truth, and so did her legal team. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. A gavel struck wood, the beginning of what would become a defining moment in the courtroom. The prosecutor stood, walking toward the center of the room, pausing for effect before addressing the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, today we will present undeniable proof that Officer Graves provided false testimony against Ms. Leavitt. His words were not just incorrect, they were deliberate fabrications designed to incriminate an innocent person. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Graves shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping restlessly against the wooden stand. He had testified in court many times before, but this time was different. He was not here as the enforcer of the law, but as the accused. Karoline remained calm, but inside, she understood the gravity of this moment. She had spent years navigating the political landscape, and she had faced opposition before. But this was personal. This was about more than just her. It was about every individual who had ever been falsely accused, every person who had been silenced by authority figures who abused their power. The prosecution wasted no time. A screen flickered to life, displaying dash cam footage from the night of the incident. The room collectively leaned forward. The grainy video showed Karoline's hands visible at all times, her voice calm as she complied with the officer's instructions. The scene directly contradicted the aggressive, threatening behavior Graves had described in his official report. The jury exchanged glances. Even the judge's expression darkened. Graves swallowed hard, his confidence visibly shaken as the footage played. Whispers rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. The weight of the moment settled over everyone, but none felt it more than Graves himself. He had underestimated Karoline, not realizing that the woman he tried to paint as a criminal had since risen to one of the most powerful positions in the country. And now, the truth was unraveling in front of everyone. Months before the courtroom showdown, the events that led to this moment unfolded on a quiet evening in downtown Boston. Karoline Leavitt had been driving home from a late-night meeting when she noticed flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. She sighed, pulling over to the side of the road, her mind running through the possible reasons for the stop. She hadn't been speeding, her taillights were working, and she hadn't violated any traffic laws. Officer Daniel Graves approached her window, his face unreadable beneath the glow of the streetlights. She rolled down the window and greeted him politely, her hands resting on the steering wheel in clear sight. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" Graves didn't respond immediately. Instead, he scanned her car with a flashlight before finally speaking. "License and registration." Karoline reached for her glove compartment, moving slowly and deliberately. The officer's posture remained rigid, his tone clipped. Something felt off. She handed him the documents, watching as he scrutinized them. A long pause followed before he spoke again. "Step out of the vehicle." She blinked. "Is there a reason for that?" Graves' expression hardened. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Realizing she had little choice, Karoline complied. The night air was crisp as she stood on the pavement, her heart beating steadily but firmly. She had handled tough situations before, but something about this felt different, like a test, a provocation. Graves circled her car, peering inside as if searching for something incriminating. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he finally asked. "No, officer," she replied evenly. "You were obstructing justice." A crease formed between her brows. "Obstructing justice? How?" "You failed to yield properly back at that intersection, and now you're questioning an officer's authority." Karoline knew the intersection he was referring to. She had made a legal turn. And questioning an officer's authority? That was a stretch, a dangerous one. "Officer, I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Graves cut her off. Are you resisting? The words sent a jolt of realization through her. This wasn't a routine stop. This was something else entirely. She steadied her breath, choosing her words carefully. No, officer. I am fully complying. But it didn't matter. Within moments, Graves had radioed in for backup, escalating the situation beyond reason. The next thing she knew, she was being placed in handcuffs, her rights being read aloud as if she were some dangerous criminal. The booking process was humiliating. She was fingerprinted, photographed, and processed like a common offender. Her name, once associated with political ambition and media appearances, was now attached to an arrest record. The weight of it all settled in her chest like a stone. She knew the truth. She knew what had happened. And deep down, she knew she couldn't let this go unanswered. Back in the courtroom. The courtroom was silent as Officer Daniel Graves sat in the witness stand, his hands clasped together on his lap. He had been here many times before, testifying as an officer of the law. But today was different. Today, he was the one being questioned, and the weight of his own words hung over him like a storm cloud. Across the room, Karoline Leavitt sat with her attorney, her face calm but unreadable. The prosecution was about to expose the cracks in his story, and everyone in the room could feel the tension thickening. The prosecutor stepped forward, holding a copy of the police report in one hand. He cleared his throat before addressing Graves. Officer Graves, you stated in your official report that Ms. Leavitt resisted arrest, that she was uncooperative and aggressive. Is that correct? Graves nodded once. Yes, sir, that's correct. The prosecutor glanced at the jury, then turned back to Graves. And you also stated that she made verbal threats toward you, that she attempted to interfere with police work and refused to comply with your commands? That's right. Graves' voice was steady, but there was a slight shift in his posture, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The prosecutor walked to the defense table where a laptop was set up. Your Honor, we have evidence that directly contradicts this testimony, he announced, turning toward the judge. The judge nodded. Proceed. The lights dimmed slightly as the screen flickered to life, displaying the dashcam footage from Graves' own patrol car. The room held its breath as the video played. The screen showed Karoline's vehicle pulling over smoothly, her hands on the wheel as she waited. When Graves approached, she responded politely, her voice calm. The footage captured every word exchanged between them. Good evening, officer. Is there a problem? License and registration. Her movements were slow, deliberate. The video continued, showing her exit the vehicle without protest, standing still as Graves walked around her car. But then came the most damning part, the moment where Graves accused her of obstruction. Her voice in the recording was steady, confused, not aggressive in the slightest. Officer, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. Are you resisting? The room shifted with uneasy murmurs. The video clearly showed that she was not resisting, nor had she made any threats. The contrast between the footage and the written police report was undeniable. The prosecutor let the video finish before turning back to Graves. Officer, would you care to explain why your report states that Ms. Leavitt resisted and acted aggressively when the footage shows the exact opposite? Graves' jaw tightened. He shifted in his seat, his confidence unraveling before the jury's eyes. His silence spoke louder than any defense he could muster. Karoline watched, her heart steady. The truth was no longer just her word against his. The evidence had spoken for itself. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Officer Daniel Graves sat rigidly in the witness stand, his fingers gripping the edge of the wooden surface in front of him. His face, once composed and authoritative, now looked pale under the unforgiving lights. Across from him, Karoline Leavitt remained poised, her expression unreadable. But she knew what was coming. The prosecutor paced slowly in front of the jury, his hands clasped behind his back. Officer Graves, would you say that honesty is the foundation of law enforcement? Graves hesitated before responding. Yes, of course. The prosecutor stopped pacing and turned to face him directly. And would you agree that an officer of the law, under oath, should always provide truthful testimony? Graves swallowed hard. Yes. The prosecutor nodded, as if satisfied with the answer. Then he walked over to the defense table, picking up a folder filled with official documents. He lifted one sheet and held it up for the court to see. Officer Graves, do you recognize this report? Graves shifted in his seat. That's my police report from the night in question. And you stand by the statements you made in this report? That Karoline Leavitt was aggressive, non-compliant, and obstructing justice. Graves nodded. I do. The prosecutor exhaled slowly, then turned toward the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, before we proceed any further, I believe there's something critical this court needs to understand. He let the silence stretch for dramatic effect before finally dropping the revelation that would shake the entire courtroom. My client, Karoline Leavitt, is not just another citizen falsely accused of a crime. She is the current spokesperson for the White House. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously, camera shutters clicked, and even the judge raised an eyebrow at the unexpected statement. Graves, however, looked completely blindsided. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The reality of what he had done was just beginning to sink in. The prosecutor walked closer to the stand. Tell me, Officer Graves, were you aware of this? Graves blinked, his lips pressing together in a tight line. No, he cut himself off, struggling for words. His eyes darted toward Karoline as if seeing her for the first time. The prosecutor didn't let up. So just to be clear, you falsely accused, arrested, and then lied under oath about a woman who now holds one of the most publicly scrutinized positions in the country. Graves had no answer. The weight of his actions was now magnified tenfold. The jury members exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Karoline remained still, her eyes locked on Graves. This case was no longer just about her. It was about every person who had ever been falsely accused, every voice that had been silenced. And now the truth was out. There was no undoing it. The weight of the revelation hung in the courtroom like a thick fog, suffocating and inescapable. Officer Daniel Graves sat frozen in the witness stand, his face drained of all color. His mind raced, trying to grasp the full extent of the disaster unfolding before him. He had lied under oath, confident that his word as a police officer would hold more weight than the testimony of a so-called ordinary citizen. But now he realized the truth. Karoline Leavitt was far from ordinary. The prosecutor let the moment linger, allowing the jury and the spectators to absorb what had just been revealed. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, reporters whispering urgently into their phones, typing feverishly on their laptops. The judge tapped his gavel twice, calling for order, but even he couldn't hide the look of disbelief in his eyes. Graves shifted uncomfortably. He had spent years in law enforcement, testifying in dozens of cases where his word had been taken as absolute truth. But now, for the first time, he was the one being scrutinized. His past cases would be reviewed, his credibility questioned, his future in law enforcement all but obliterated. The prosecutor turned back to him. Officer Graves, now that we've established the truth, let me ask you this. How many other times have you falsified reports? Graves' mouth opened, then closed again. He knew he couldn't answer that question without digging himself into an even deeper hole. Instead, he stared at the table in front of him, his hands clenched into fists. The judge sighed and turned toward the defense. Miss Leavitt, do you have anything you'd like to say before we proceed? Karoline slowly stood, her posture straight, her expression calm yet commanding. The cameras in the back of the courtroom zoomed in on her as she took a deep breath before speaking. Your Honor, what happened to me is not just about me. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that no officer, no person in power, can manipulate the system for their own benefit. If this could happen to me, someone with resources and a platform, then what does that say for those who don't have a voice? The courtroom was silent, hanging on her every word. I am not seeking revenge, she continued, her gaze locking onto Graves, but I am seeking justice. Not just for myself, but for everyone who has been falsely accused, silenced, or ignored. The system only works if the truth matters, and today, the truth has prevailed. The judge nodded, his expression unreadable. Thank you, Ms. Leavitt. We will reconvene shortly to discuss the next steps. As Karoline sat back down, she could feel the weight of history shifting in her favor. The truth had won, but the battle for justice was far from over. This case would leave a mark, a warning that no one, not even those in uniform, was above the law. As the courtroom emptied, the echoes of the gavel still lingered in the air. Karoline Leavitt remained seated, her hands clasped together, absorbing everything that had transpired. Justice had been served, but the weight of the moment sat heavy on her shoulders. She had won, not just for herself, but for every individual who had ever been falsely accused, for those whose voices had gone unheard, for those who had been powerless against the system. But victory did not erase the experience. It did not undo the fear, the humiliation, the helplessness she had felt when Officer Graves had twisted the truth to serve his own narrative. As she looked around the emptying courtroom, she saw the faces of those who had followed her case closely. Some were fellow politicians, allies who had supported her through the ordeal. Others were complete strangers, people who had seen themselves in her story, ordinary citizens who had long distrusted a system that often seemed stacked against them. And then there were the journalists, their pens scratching against their notepads, eager to dissect every moment of what had unfolded. Karoline exhaled slowly. The battle in the courtroom was over, but the war for justice was ongoing. The reality was that her case had been exceptional, not in the sense that what happened to her was rare, but in that she had the resources, the platform, and the influence to fight back. How many others had suffered similar fates, but never received the opportunity to clear their names? How many had been wrongfully convicted, unable to challenge those in power? Officer Daniel Graves would face consequences for his lies, but Karoline knew that he was just one individual in a much larger problem. His downfall would serve as an example, but it would not fix a flawed system overnight. The real change would come from exposing the deeper issues that allowed injustices like this to happen in the first place. As she stood, a familiar voice called her name. She turned to see her attorney approaching, his expression a mix of relief and admiration. "You handled yourself well in there," he said. She nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "It wasn't just about me." "No," he agreed. "But your voice made a difference. And it will continue to." Karoline glanced toward the reporters who were still waiting outside the courtroom doors. She knew they would be eager for a statement, for a reaction. But she didn't just want to talk about what had happened. She wanted to talk about what came next. How this moment could serve as a catalyst for something bigger than herself. She straightened her shoulders and walked toward the exit. Justice had been served, but the fight for a fairer system was far from over. And she was ready to take it on.